And now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of how government works by looking at state legislatures. Governors typically get all of the credit and all of the blame for everything that goes on in the state. But the most important thing to realize is that it's the legislatures who are doing all of the grunt work. And they're the ones putting the budgets together. And they're the ones deciding how things are paid for, where they're being paid from, and so on. So you think about how a legislature works. The legislature is supposed to do many things like deal with constitutional amendments, they serve constituents, they oversee state agencies, but the most important thing to realize is that they're the ones putting together the budgets. There are professional legislatures, and when we say that they are professionalized, what we're saying is that they are working on a full-time basis. Illinois would be an example of a full-time legislature. There are other legislatures that we would consider to be amateurs or amateur legislatures, which means they work on a part-time basis. New Hampshire would be a good example of an amateur state legislature. The diversity of a state legislature is usually determined by how seats are drawn up, how they are gerrymandered and reapportioned. So you see that only about 9 to 10% of representation in state legislatures nationwide are made up of African American representatives. Hispanic representation about 3 to 4%. Native American and Asian American about 1% each. So you see that has a lot to do with how a district is drawn up. And we'll get to that in a second. This is like beating a dead horse. All we're talking about here is that every time someone runs for office, local, state, or federal, you have to raise money to be competitive. And on the state side here, the most important thing to realize is that most people run unopposed, that they don't have anybody in opposition to them. So being from Illinois, you'll find that many seats, at least in the Cook County area, are drawn up for Democrats to win, and therefore the Democrats know that they're going to win that race, and the Republicans don't even bother putting up a candidate to run in that particular district. So sometimes you'll show up on election day and you'll only see one name under a certain House race or a certain Senate race. And once you get into office, you run for re-election. You're the person known as the incumbent. There are a lot of resources, both financial and let's just say social resources that are on your side that can get you re-elected without any problem. So if you're a challenger, as I tell all of my students, if you know of anybody who's running for office, or if you've ever thought about running for office, you have to ask yourself the number one question: can I win? And if the answer is no, then don't bother. But if you give yourself a chance to win, you better have enough money and resources in order to make your race a competitive race. Did you answer your census form? Every 10 years, the census is taken. We decide how many people, or we figure out how many people live in a particular district. The more people who live in a district, the more advantageous it is to draw up that district to favor that district over other districts. If a district starts to lose population, you might find yourself combined with another House or Senate district, and therefore you might lose some influence, especially if your political party is on the outs and you are a Republican and you are going to be in a Democratic district, or if you are a Democrat being in a combined Republican district, your chances of having your voice heard are very, very slim. The gerrymandering process takes place every 10 years through reapportionment, but the drawing up of districts is highly political. It's something that nobody likes, and everybody pretends that only one political party does it, but both political parties do it. And why they do it is to make sure that their political party always gets their candidates reelected into that office every 4 years. You always hear the phrase, where somebody asks the question, do you like sausage? And the answer is yes, but would you like the sausage if you knew how it was made? And you probably say no. And what you see here is that there are a lot of backroom dealings that go on, a lot of problems that take place with the state legislatures in trying to get votes passed and legislation pushed forward. I always liken it to when you have a project that's due at the end of the semester, but you have many projects and many papers due, and therefore you decide to do it at the last minute. The item that you're doing, the project that you're doing, the paper that you're doing probably wouldn't be as good if you did it all at the end, if you would have just started right from the beginning. And that's the same thing with legislation. Sometimes there's so many pieces of legislation that get pushed forward all at the same time, and they're not voted on right away, and therefore they're kind of hung up, and we have something called a logjam, and we end up getting legislation that might not be as perfect as we want it to be. So we, instead of putting out A work, we put out C+ work, and then we deal with it after the C+ work is actually turned in. Understand that many, like I said in the beginning, there is something called professional legislatures. There's also amateur legislatures. If you're in a professional legislature, you pretty much want to stay in that position. You don't find many people moving up into other positions because they're in a professional system. It's sort of like job security. You kind of like the job that you already have, but it does help to be in a professional legislature because you get a bigger staff and a bigger budget, and you have a better chance of getting reelected. Those who are amateurs pretty much stay in for a few years, and it's really a part-time job. And they keep their job as teacher, farmer, doctor, and don't get into professional government or career government jobs. Those who are in a professional system, we see it in Illinois. There are some people who have been in office for 30, 40 years, and they have no intention of going anyplace else. Before a vote can be cast as a bill, it has to go through the committee process where we mark up the bills. This is where all of the nitty-gritty work takes place in amending a bill or giving suggestions to a bill before it's moved to a full House or a full Senate vote. There are a lot of leadership roles, expert roles. We tend to look at some state legislators as experts in their field. We're hoping that somebody who works, let's say, on the education committee was a teacher or is a teacher. Somebody who is in, dealing with health was a doctor or is a doctor. Knows somebody who's in the medical field, and so on and so forth. We also have to deal with ethical behavior, but being from Illinois, we know so much about that. That comes along with the territory, dealing with ethics. And then also, we have to understand that not many states have term limits. The argument against term limits is that people who are in office know how the process works. So if you term limited them, you'd have to start over from scratch, and you would lose that professional expertise of a legislator. People who are in favor of term limits would say, get rid of the bums, get rid of those people who are doing this for a career. That's not what that's not what the goal is or the charge is of being a legislator. But you'll see that not many states, like I said, have term limits. There are some states that have two-party competitiveness when it comes to Republicans versus Democrats, but overall you'll find many states that are one party in the legislature, or at least one party always seems to control one house over the other, and so on. But you won't find a third-party movement anywhere. And also remember, too, when it comes to the two-house legislature, the bicameral legislatures, in the state legislatures itself, only Nebraska has a unicameral system, a one-house legislature. Biggest problem today with the media is that we really don't have local media like we should. So if we don't have local media, we're not going to know what's going on in our state legislatures. We probably know, since we live in Cook County or around Cook County, more about what's going on in Chicago than we do know of what's going on in Springfield. And quickly to wrap up, interest groups have a tremendous interest in, or tremendous influence, in our state legislatures, just like they do at the federal level. And finally, our state legislatures are not very popular, no matter how much we try to put icing on that cake. If it's really not made very well, we're probably not going to like it. And when you look at how, no matter how professionalized our legislators are, how many resources they have, we pretty much don't like our state legislatures. And that might have a lot to do with how we just don't like politics in general.